So we've talked about what flowers are, about the reproductive parts of plants, how to put a flower together genetically, and then just kind of backing up to the process of actually initiating flowers. I mentioned early on that being able to initiate flowers across the whole plant at the same time is valuable, right? So to unify all the flower production is a good strategy for timing your flowers to be open at the same time. These flowers are going to be exchanging pollen with each other, then the pollen producing flowers should be open and available at the same time as the pollen receiving flowers. So how does a plant synchronize within itself and also synchronize with other plants in the area? This is going to be important for achieving sexual reproduction. And this diagram is kind of hairy, but I think it's a good way to get us started on thinking about this. This is basically summarizing the variety of ways that different plants can respond to the signals of the environment or signals within their own plant body that tell them that it's the right time to flower. So I'll just work through these, I guess, a little bit at a time. So one signal is light. So not just the presence of light, but features about the light. And we'll see that light, for example, the light of day length is going to be a signal that plants can key into. So some plants are using the presence of light to tell them when it's a good time to flower. And then the arrows connect. And then down here at the bottom, this is basically the making of a flower. So these arrows signal, boom, 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 flower is made. Other options, vernalization is the process of sensing cold. And going through a period of cold can be necessary for some plants to flower. This autonomous pathway, autonomous refers to basically conditions within the plant itself. So internal conditions. This refers to the plant basically sensing how big it is or how long it's been growing and using that as a measure for when it's a good time to flower. Other ones, abundance of energy, sucrose, gibberellins. This is one of the pathways that involves hormones. Gibberellin is a hormone. But we have a few, at least over here, environmental conditions that can tell plants when it's time to flower. So mentioning the shift from vegetative to reproductive, there's also a shift in the genes that are active at this point. And so any of these environmental effects that cause a shift from vegetative to reproductive growth, they're going to sense the environment and then cause this change to happen. So they sort of take the information and pass it on, and that causes a big change here. So this one's just a set of images pointing out vernalization, this process of going through a cold period. We have basically a vegetative shoot tip here, and then afterwards, one that's gone on to produce reproductive growth. One of the ways that plants are sensing light, I mentioned plants can sense day length, and we're going to talk for a little while about this one, is a molecule called phytochrome. Phytochrome is a protein, and it's often diagrammed as this kind of rabbit ears sort of appearance. It's a protein that exists in one of two forms. So it's a protein that changes shape depending on the light conditions. So we'll start over here. One of its forms is called PR, and the R stands for red light. So this form, the first form that's made, is sensitive to red light, and if it absorbs red light, then it switches shape to this other form. And that form is called PFR, and the FR stands for far red light. So they're kind of indicated here. These are not too far off from the actual colors, red light and far red light. If the PFR form encounters far red light, then it changes back. Sorry, this arrow here. So depending on which light is more abundant, red light or far red light, if you have a lot of red light, you're going to have a lot of PFR. If you have a lot of far red light, you've got a lot of PR. So it takes a little while to think about it. So they're named by the color that they absorb. So if they absorb far red light, that actually decreases the amount of PFR because they've converted into PR. So you can convert them back and forth quickly In nature, this isn't something that, nature isn't just shining different colors of light on plants all the time. Their habitat should have a pretty constant color of light. But what it is, what it does show us is that we can change this in the laboratory. So we'll see some experiments where scientists can shine different lights on the plant and get them to change their perception of the environment. One last conversion here is shown at the bottom, this slow conversion. So red light, if there's bright light in the environment, that behaves a lot like red light. So if you just had bright direct sunlight, that would cause a lot of conversion into this PFR form. And that happens, as you can see here, during the day. So sun's out, shining, converts a lot of our phytochrome into PFR. When the light is gone, sometimes this is described as the active form. When the light's gone, it slowly, these revert back to the PR form. And that slow change in darkness is kind of like a little egg timer for how long is the darkness. If you've got a long darkness, then you're going to convert a lot of these PFR back to PR during the night. If you have short darkness, say in the summer we have shorter nights, then you might not convert as many PFR back to PR. So it's a little bit of a timer for day length, daylight abundance, and also color. And I'll point out some of these. Sorry, this one's kind of hairy. This one, maybe we'll just focus on here. This is the spectra of light that these different forms absorb in. So PR absorbs very strongly in the red region of the spectrum, and PFR absorbs more in the far red end of the spectrum. Let's just skip over the rest of this. Just kind of a nice illustration of red versus far red. Again, the world doesn't have to be shining red light on these plants. These are colors they're sensitive to, and they're basically sensing the relative abundance of these. So is there more red or more far red in their local environment? So I just, there's a link to the website here. If you wanted to match a wavelength of color with the actual visible color, you can look it up on here and get computer codes for what colors you're looking at. Red and far red. So as I mentioned, red is basically the color of bright sunlight is rich in red. Bright sunlight is basically rich in lots of colors, but as plants see it, they're going to see this as kind of the more predominant wavelength that phytochrome is responding to. So in bright sunlight, much more of this perceived by the plant, and that's going to convert to the PFR form. And maybe a little more useful to think about, shade is not all colors of light. Shade is actually a lot more enriched for this far red end of the spectrum. And this is like shade under a tree, right? So I call it plant shade here. So if you're shaded by a tree, what is taking up the light that doesn't get to you? Well, it's leaves. So it's basically this far red light is like the plant light leftovers. Anything that didn't get picked up by photosynthesis is allowed to go through, and it's kind of enriched in the visible spectrum anyway for this far red color. Just an illustration of that. On the, let's start with the right here. So this is like the absorbance, the wavelengths of light that are present in sunlight. So pretty kind of uniform throughout. And in shade light, pretty low, but only in these colors up to about 700 nanometers. So up through the reds. And then there's actually an abundance here in the shade. There's abundance of light that's not quite used, not used by plants. And that reflects there's a steep drop off here, about 700 nanometers, region of light that is present in sunlight still, but not really absorbed by plants. So it's getting through. So that becomes a signal to a plant that you're in the shade. You're being shaded by a plant. And that could explain one of the big advantages of phytochrome sensing this far red light is plants can tell that they're in the shade of another plant. Now, some plants can grow just fine in the shade of other plants. We have shade plants you can buy at the hardware store. They have ways of picking up those wavelengths that are a little more efficient than the average plant. This is photosynthetically active radiation, PAR, you might have seen before. So this basically shows how effective these different colors of light would be at letting a plant do photosynthesis. So it's pretty effective, roughly between 400 and 700 nanometers of light, a lot of the colors in the visible spectrum, and not super effective without some extra help past 700 nanometers. Okay, so going back to one of our other functions of phytochrome, we saw that phytochrome changes forms depending on these light colors that it's encountering. So red and far red light. And the other conversion was to convert in the darkness. So I mentioned how phytochrome converting from the PFR back to the PR form happens in the darkness is kind of a timer for how long darkness was. And plants can key into that, and some plants are very responsive to that when it comes time to flower. So we have two kinds of plants. Just generally, we can talk about them as short day plants or long day plants. So let's look at the first two panels of both of these to start. This one shows a long day and a short night. So in a 24-hour period, if you're in the in the summer of Wisconsin, you're getting more day and less night. And so that's a signal to this plant not to flower. If you switch to anything after the equinox, so after the end of spring, after the start of, let's say that again. Start of fall is when the days get shorter and the nights get longer, and that becomes a signal, short days, long nights. In this kind of plant, this is a signal that says you should flower. So this might be a plant that flowers in the late summer as it detects a shorter days. So that makes it a short day plant. It's flowering during shorter days. Over here, the long day plants are also responding to the day length, but they have the opposite response where they prefer to flower on long days. So maybe they're equipped to flower in the middle of the summer when the days first get long, and they're not going to flower on these short days. On the spring and the fall would prevent them from flowering. Okay, so that's kind of their natural growth. And this third panel on both of them shows what can happen if you just shine some light in the middle of the night. So this really just illustrates that what the plants are measuring is not the length of the day, but they're actually measuring the length of the night. And if you interrupt that, it's almost like getting a bad night's sleep, right? If somebody wakes you up in the middle of the night, shines a light on you, you didn't get a full night's sleep. Plants feel the same way. So that light flash will convert some of their phytochrome back to the daylight form, which happens quickly, and they kind of forget all the night they've experienced up to that point. And the rest of the night isn't very long, and they kind of forget that it was a long night. So they treat it like a short night, and they don't flower. And over here, they treat it like a short night, and they do flower. And this is just illustrating as the year goes on, different seasons have different relative lengths of day and length of night. These are experimental conditions, I should say. So one of these is 24 hours of day. Those are nice days. And just a switch here, like you can measure exactly how long the day should be or how short it has to be before one of these switches happen from flowering to not flowering or the other way around. So highlighted one here that is long day plant, not flowering on these short days, and then a rather quick shift to flowering on the longer days, and then opposite for these short day plants. Find out exactly what length of day they're measuring. And this is a response that can be tweaked by the plant as selection goes on. So kind of figure out the right time for it to flower. So we saw that you can interrupt the light in the middle of the night and give it the impression of a short night. There's also, by using this far red light exposure, you can kind of reset it. So we saw basically this before, where a flash of light, a flash of red light will interrupt the night and make it look like it's not a long night. But if you do red and then later far red, even just a brief flash of light, that resets it back to looking like it was dark. And it's going to think that it was actually dark for a longer period during this time. It's going to look like a short day. Right, and so our short day plant flowers and our long day plant does not flower. And you can do that over and over again. And basically, just as long as the last flash was red, it's going to look like it was a short night. As long as the last flash was far red, it's going to look like it was a long night. Plants aren't, super bright. This is exactly what they're keying into. Okay, so that was day length and phytochrome. Lots of plants respond to phytochrome. We can talk about why it's advantageous to respond to the length of the day, so determining a time of year when it's good to flower and so on. Another response that plants have is called vernalization. And vernal is a term you might have seen before. We have vernal pools. This refers to the spring. So vernalization is a process that basically, in a lot of cases, causes plants to flower in the spring. I think that's how it got its name. But it's a response actually to cold or growing through a winter, basically, around here. And these are some plants that would have that experience. So a lot of plants in the mustard family, they do a lot of growing in their first year, but they don't make flowers in their first year. So they grow, they get energy, they're doing photosynthesis, they're purely vegetative. And then around here in Wisconsin, the winter hits and they got to shut down. So they don't die, but they go dormant, and their tissues experience the signal that it is really cold out there. So with this cold conditions outside, it basically kind of clears the signal and says, you've been through some cold, and that primes them that the next time it's warm again, then they can do something like flower. So if you put this plant through a cold period and then give it a warm spring, then it's going to go through the process of flowering. If it doesn't get the winter, then it doesn't flower. So this is a case here. In the middle, this is a plant that really needs winter to flower. And in this case, they haven't given it that, and it's just continued to produce all this vegetative growth. So it never got the signal of that the winter, and just never got the signal to make flowers. Over here, this is kind of the normal condition. This is a plant that's been through winter, and then after that, it goes ahead and flowers. And then over here, this is one without cold that is missing the genetic signal, the genetic part of that process to detect the winter and respond to it, and also to require that. So you can have a mutated version that just goes ahead and flowers even if it hasn't been through winter. So again, in the natural condition, good adaptive strategy for flowering basically as soon as you can when conditions get nice in the spring. So it's not simply that they've been through cold, but also they can sense the duration of cold keeps them from flowering after, say, a warm spell in December. They sort of hole up for a while, and it takes a little more winter than just a little bit to get that signal established. All right, I'm just going to skip this one. This is a lot like what we've already seen on that other illustration. Lots of study has gone into this, so just these are gene names and all the signaling processes that involve them. So regardless of what your plant is and what the strategy is for the time of year that it flowers, it's important to flower at a time that works best for your species. So a few reasons here. One of those would be, if you're going to go through a process, flowering sometimes is a long process. It's an energy intensive process. And if you start flowers and you're not able to finish and make viable seeds at the end of that, then you might have wasted an opportunity. So if you've got a dry season or a warm season and you're not doing it right, then you might not actually successfully do sexual reproduction. So an illustration here, these are plants, they're from tropical areas. They're in the mangrove group, different plants that we call mangroves. And it shows that they're basically in tune to these dry and rainy seasons. And it's two different species that are doing different strategies. So the top species has a pretty solid performance to flower So the peaks here are the flowering regions, flowering times of the life cycle. And they're happening pretty consistently during the dry spell. So that species locked into dry seasons. This other species, a little more subtle, maybe harder to shake out a pattern, but it looks like at least here, good performance in the rainy season, a little bit of a jump there, rainy season. So different species can have different strategies. It may not always be advantageous to flower in the dry season, depending on your species, depending on your pollinators, depending on your flowers, your duration of flowers, your type of seed dispersal, all kinds of stuff. So over time, natural selection has let these plants figured out what the best way to grow is. Another strategy here, this is a collection of plants that have wind pollination. And they're keyed into a little bit different times of year. One explanation for this could be that the pollen is, if you've got wind pollination and everybody's wind pollinating on the same weekend, it's going to have plants that are receiving a lot of pollen from other species. So ideally, if you're wind pollinated, you are one of a few species that have your pollen out in the air at any one time. So there's a little bit of a rolling abundance here, where each of these species has a little block of time when it might be the only or one of just a couple species that has its pollen out in the air at one time. Lots of pollen in the air. This explains why we have pollen allergies. And unfortunately, this selection for having your pollen out at independent times of the year means that like the whole growing season is kind of abundant with pollen from different species. One of the things that's received some attention when we talk about environmental cues and timing when it comes to flowering is what's going to happen when climate change comes around. So we have predictions for increased temperatures means earlier warm days in the spring, means later cold days in the fall. Also means, as we've seen, lots different precipitation regimes. So scientists are trying to get ahead of this a little bit and say, well, what happens if I artificially warm or cool the environment a little bit? And there's just a little bit of a switch on some of these species where the warmer conditions cause things to happen earlier. So these red bars are offset to the left more than the green bars. And one of the concerns, so you can have plants that are all still synchronized within an environment, but one of the big concerns is what happens if the plants are moving in one direction, they're adapting to the environment, and the animals might be adapting in a different direction. So if a plant needs to line up with its pollinators, they're no longer in sync anymore, then one of them is going to leave unhappy. So either plants aren't getting pollinated or insects aren't getting their nectar food. It's a finely orchestrated ecology that can be messed up by changing the timing of these events. Another one, this term phenology refers to basically the way that plants look at any one time of year. And this is the leaf out, the time of year when leaves appear after the winter. And what it's showing, different parts of the country, this is 2018. A lot of them are in this red zone where their leaves are coming out significantly earlier than they normally do in the long-term data. So definitely some clear patterns here. We're getting big shifts in how really just whatever environment these plants are sensing all throughout the world is changing. So they're changing with it, but it might not always be for the best.